This video is not a tutorial in the strictest sense. I'm titling it and videos like it How I Videos. And what I'm trying to communicate is that this is going to be a discussion of the steps and process that I took to create something. It's not going to be a step-by-step guide on how to do some specific task, but instead an exploration of my process and a bit of insight into the way that I solved a particular problem. And just to show you how serious I am about this not a tutorial, look at all the room for activities that we have.
You'll give us so much extra space in our room to do activities.
I think every good project starts with a clear problem that you're trying to address. For us, the problem that I was trying to address here is that I started a couple of YouTube channels, I don't know, 6 or 7 months ago at this point. And one of them was a gaming channel. And every week I would put up the stream videos that I had created during the previous week. And they were these impenetrable 5+ hour videos that I don't think anyone would ever look at in any way, shape, or form. And unsurprisingly, pretty much no one did. As we discussed in a previous video, one of the mechanisms that can be used to get people to engage with your videos is better thumbnails. And I had literally no thumbnails. I used YouTube's automatic thumbnail creation, which basically took a random, usually particularly uninteresting frame of whatever game I was playing and put it as the thumbnail. The other issue that I was facing is 5 hours of video is unsurprisingly difficult to digest or approach. I don't expect anyone to sit down and say, oh, for the next 5 hours, I'm going to watch Alden play fill in the blank game. So that was my clear and present problem statement. I needed to find a better way to divide up the content that I was creating while I was playing games, and I needed to create some more attractive and enticing thumbnails to go with it. The solution to the first problem is not what we're here to talk about, but just to share a little bit of inside baseball, I added a split function to the application that I use to control my streaming. And so each time I have a good breakpoint in a particular game, I just push that button and it splits my recordings up into multiple pieces, and I can schedule those to upload each and every day. But actually, solving that problem made the second problem even worse, because I went from having 4 videos that were getting uploaded to my YouTube channel a week to having somewhere in the neighborhood of 20+ videos, each desperately needing its own engaging thumbnail that didn't look samey and made people feel like I had spent some time creating something. And I wanted to do all of this without breaking the time bank. I didn't want to end up spending 4 or 5 hours a week just sitting in a image editor of my choosing, tweaking thumbnails to make them just right. So that's the thing that I solved for myself. I found a way to create thumbnails quickly that looked at least vaguely handcrafted and do it for many, many videos a week in a relatively timely fashion. And this leads us to the first step in that journey, which was to manually create some thumbnails. I know that's ultimately the thing that I'm trying to avoid, but I can't stress enough the importance of suffering at the hands of something before you try to automate it. It's really, really critically important in my experience to understand the pain points by kind of living them before you try to solve the problem that you foresee you're going to have. And so I made this collection of 7 thumbnails for my first 7 episodic videos that I uploaded to my YouTube channel. And what I came to realize is that the task was painfully repetitive. For each one of these, I was importing a picture of my face, adding a number, then adding some outlines, making sure that the game background looked good, and then exporting the image. And then doing this over and over and over again until I had made all of the thumbnails that I needed to make. So now I had suffered. I had a handle on how painful it would be to create all of these thumbnails each and every week. And the fact that it was painfully repetitious was a great indication that automation was going to be an amazing match for this particular problem. But before I could start sketching out a plan, I needed to really understand what I was working with. And for me, there was one tool that I was planning to use for this particular problem, and that's a open source free piece of image editing software called Gimp. And Gimp is essentially a Photoshop analog that provides you all of the major things that you would want to do in photo editing. You can do retouching, you can do masking, you can do cropping, scaling, all of the standard photo editing functions. And in addition to that, it had something that made it particularly attractive, and that is Gimp allows you to script in Python. Python, for those who don't know, is a programming language and a very capable programming language at that. So the fact that Gimp allowed me to write some level of automation in Python made it kind of a perfect match for this problem. At least I thought so. I say I thought so because I didn't know. I had done some Googling, I had found out that these APIs exist, but I hadn't really put them through their paces. And so that's where a proof of concept comes in. Basically, I wanted to create a pile of hard-coded code that solved this problem in a very specific way. I wanted to generate one thumbnail by pasting a block of code into Gimp's Python interpreter and seeing if it could make the edits that I wanted it to. So the proof of concept was a list of commands that did approximately the things that I wanted to do. For instance, it added a text object and put a number in it. It selected that text object and added a little border around it. It selected the entire image and added a border around that. And so I created all of these commands to prove to myself that with no manual intervention, no clicking buttons inside of Gimp, I could go from a blank slate all the way to a finished thumbnail. And spoiler alert, I could. I wish I had saved that code, but I don't actually know that I had it written down anywhere. It was really more just like something that I was constantly copy and pasting and making slight changes to. But nonetheless, when I got to the point where I could start from a clean slate, paste some code into Gimp's Python interpreter, and get out a finished thumbnail, that was the green light for me to start designing. The design wasn't particularly complicated. Sometimes when you're designing really large and complicated systems, you'll go through a whole requirements analysis where you figure out all of the things a system needs to do. And I did a little bit of that mostly in my head. I knew that I wanted to be able to create a bunch of thumbnails. I wanted each thumbnail to have a different face and a different number on it. I wanted to color code the border of each thumbnail so that it could be quickly correlated to what game I was playing. And as a bit of a stretch goal, I wanted to be able to give the program hints as to what type of mood I was in at the end of that particular round. Was it an exciting, happy ending? Did I fail miserably and I was sad? And I wanted that to be reflected in the face that it chose for that particular thumbnail. And so I settled on the inputs for this first version being the starting number of the episode, the number of episodes, the game that I was playing, the foreground and background color, and then a list of moods that correlated to each thumbnail that was being created. And the idea was that if I gave all of this information to the program that I was writing, it would have everything that it needed to generate all of the thumbnails that I wanted for a particular game. In programming terms, this was essentially the interface that I was creating. And the rest of the work that I needed to do was then writing the program that would take that information and do the steps that needed to be done in light of each of the tips that I had given it. Each piece of information that I had provided it would tell it what to do. Now, the other thing that I need to mention before we go any further is the notion of layers, because they were important to me kind of cracking the code on how to make this work effectively. In most modern image editors, you have a notion of layers, and you can think of a layer like those old overhead projectors where you can have one image on one layer and then you can put something else on top of it. And if you drew horns and a mustache on the top layer, then it wouldn't change the layer below it, but the total stack of layers would show some combination of them, where each layer on top of the previous layer shows above the layers below it. And layers and layer groups were particularly important to my strategy because there was a lot of image data that the program wasn't going to be creating. The program was going to be creating the episode numbers, the outlines, but obviously it wasn't going to be creating my face or the background for a particular game. And so as a result, I was creating these particular elements ahead of time in ways that were particularly easy for the computer to understand and find at a later date. The three main sections that I created were faces, that's the main layer group, and then within that there were happy faces and sad faces. Then decorations, which is what I used to refer to all of the edits that I was going to make, and this was particularly useful because after each thumbnail is generated, I need to clear it out. So all of the stuff that I had added, I wanted to put in one place that I could easily find and delete. And then the game section, which was essentially all of the backgrounds. So for each game, I would create one time a custom background that denoted what game it was. So with that design work done, it was time to code up the first version. And the first version's interface ended up looking a lot like this. I would type out this command, and when I ran it, it would generate a set of thumbnails based on the inputs that I had provided in that function call, where a function call is just how I pass the information the computer needs to know what to do to the thing that's actually doing the work. The program structure was nothing complicated. Basically, I wrote a function that builds a thumbnail. I then wrote a function that for each thumbnail that needs to be built calls build a thumbnail, and then wrote an export the thumbnail and a reset the thumbnail function. And basically, once I had those, I could have that overarching build thumbnails function call build a thumbnail, export a thumbnail, reset the thumbnail over and over again, and I would end up with a whole heap of thumbnails at the end of it. And that worked for me for about a week or two. But this command that I alluded to before was clunky, to say the least. It didn't solve all of the problems that I wanted it to, and I knew that I could do better. And so it was time to refine our problem statement. I wanted a better user interface, right? The thing that I was interacting with, I wanted it to be more intuitive and less awkward. And I also wanted to make it a little more generalized because I recognized that much of the work that we did in the proof of concept stage was a bit hard-coded, and I wanted it to be a bit more flexible for potential future improvements. Enter version 2. Version 2 is where Sheets enters the equation, specifically Google Sheets, but really any spreadsheet would have done. But the idea was I wanted each row in a spreadsheet to represent one thumbnail that I wanted to create. The biggest advantage of this is that I could then go and create all, let's say, 20 thumbnails that I wanted to make as rows in a spreadsheet, and I wouldn't have to worry about them all having the same foreground color or background color. But I didn't have a good answer for how to get the information from point A to point B. AKA, I could write down in Google Sheets exactly how I wanted the thumbnails to turn up, but it wasn't trivial to get that information into this Python interpreter inside of Gimp so that it could execute on my request. The solution that I came up with was to use something called JSON. JSON is a data representation that takes the form of just a string, basically. Like you can imagine it as a line of text in a document. It has a certain structure where it matches up keys and values. So you might have a key that's name was game, and then the value might be the name of the game. But all of that's a bit in the weeds. What I did was add a script to my Google Sheet that allowed me to take the contents of the sheet and export it as a block of JSON that I could then paste into the command prompt, and I could rewrite the program in a way that it parsed out the information from that block of JSON and then knew how to, for each object in that JSON array, build a thumbnail. So the new structure of the program looked very similar to the old structure, but instead the first step was to parse the JSON that I had provided and then figure out what each of the thumbnails were going to look like. Then, once it knew that, all it had to do was generate each thumbnail almost exactly the same way that it had previously done. One tricky little addition that I did here was I made each column potentially represent a modular edit that needed to be done. So as an example, you can imagine episode number is its own self-contained action, right? It needs to place text in a particular spot, make that text say a certain thing, etc. And so rather than having my build a thumbnail function be a monolithic kind of hard-coded list of steps, I instead had it iterate over each of the columns that it had been provided and determine if there are any edits that need to be done associated with it by matching the title of the column to a function on the thumbnail builder object that I had created. So this new version was a clear improvement. We had gone from a kind of awkward bit of code that I had to write each time to having to type some things into a spreadsheet, click some buttons, and then paste that into a Python interpreter inside of Gimp. It was an improvement, but we weren't quite there yet. In V3, it was all about linking Gimp and Sheets directly, right? In an ideal world, I didn't want to have to do any copy and pasting. I wanted to be able to run my program in Gimp and have it pull all the information in from Sheets and generate all of the thumbnails that I had defined inside of the sheet for that given week. But this proved to be a somewhat tricky problem to solve. And the reason is that Gimp and its version of Python is a bit hobbled and antiquated. To be a bit more specific, Python generally relies on something called pip, which is the Python package manager. And what pip does is it allows you to install additional chunks of code that will help you to do specialized things. And so for me, the section of code that I was looking for was one that would allow me to securely connect to the Google services and then pull data out of my particular spreadsheet. But Gimp's version of Python did not come with pip, nor was it particularly easy to install it. I tried. So instead, what I ended up doing was I installed the version 2.7 of Python, which is old in its own right, and ran pip on a clean install of Python and tracked what files changed. And then I went and collected all the files that had changed and put them into Gimp's version of Python. And lo and behold, that got the sample code for reading data from a Google Sheet working inside of Gimp. This was the big moment for me. When I figured out how to do that, I was like, this thing may actually be something that I will use with some regularity. And so from there, it was simply a matter of ingesting all of the rows via this new Python API that I had access to, and then making sure that the data that I had ingested was in the same format that it had previously been in. So the body of my code didn't change, but I had to construct the JSON object that I needed in order for the rest of the program to work effectively. And that's really all I did in version 3. As this program became more and more mature, the changes that I were making were often a bit more aesthetic. But the one thing that kind of came back in a really awesome way was, I think I mentioned it earlier, but it was the idea that I had allowed edits to be kind of modularly created. And the reason that this came in handy was I had started playing some games that were particularly long. We're talking like a 2-hour game. And so I wanted to split that into a part 1 and a part 2. And so I was able to do that really, really easily with the framework that I had created. I created a new column, which I called subtext, and then I created a function called subtext on the thumbnail builder. And when it saw that there was a subtext field with data in it, it would add the part 2 or part 1 next to the episode number. And it would look something like this. It added a bit of complexity because I realized that then there was a bit of edit dependency going on because I needed to create the episode number first in order to know where to place part 1 or part 2 kind of down and to the right of it. And so I created this idea of priority layers, and I don't need to get into all the details of that, but that's really what the final version 4 was all about. It was about kind of putting the finishing touches and then putting into practice some of the designs that I had created in previous versions. The other two little benefits that came with these changes was I was able to move a lot of the consistency logic into the spreadsheet. So for instance, now when I select a game in the spreadsheet, it automatically fills in foreground and background color inside of the spreadsheet, so I don't have to add any logic to my program to enforce the fact that a particular game should always have a blue border. And finally, and this one is still kind of like a ongoing challenge, but I also added additional logic to try and make it so that I wouldn't have the same randomly selected face show up on 2 adjacent thumbnails. It was kind of a funny thing, and I might go back and find the particular time that it happened. But because I had 3 games that I was generating thumbnails for, the dates that each of those games' thumbnails would go live was initially indeterminate to me. And so while I was making sure that I didn't use the same face twice in a row, I wasn't necessarily checking to make sure that I was not using the same face on 2 different games videos that were going live on the same day. And so at least once since then, I think I've had 2 different videos go live on the same day using the same face. That's also a problem that could be fixed by me creating more faces for the randomization to collect from, but I'm digressing a bit. The point was, this was kind of the finishing touches, and I was in a pretty good place with V4. And that's the version that I'm still using today. So this is where we've ended up. I'm super thrilled with the way that this project turned out, in the sense that I fill out a spreadsheet with a bunch of information that helps me stay organized, right? I fill in what date each video is going live, all of the information, the pretty name for what I want the video to be titled, and then I push enter in Gimp, and totally hands off, it generates a whole bunch of thumbnails. I'll probably put a shot of that happening right now. Unfortunately, it's not particularly impressive to watch. I think if you look at the folder in particular, you'll probably see thumbnails popping up down there, but Gimp doesn't update the GUI each time it generates a thumbnail, so you don't really see the edits happening live. But that's kind of a small complaint. But for now, this is the solution that I use. Each week, I fill out the spreadsheet with a bunch of information that I need to stay organized. What days are the videos going live? What's their title, etc. And then I push enter in Gimp and am provided with all of the thumbnails that I need for my uploads for that week. It's pretty painless and pretty awesome. And I've been kind of blown away by how quickly I can get 20 videos uploaded on a, say, Thursday night. It's definitely a work in progress still. One thing that I found kind of curious is right now the ability for the system to avoid repeated faces depends on the backlogs being similar for each game. And when I say backlog, I mean like how many videos do I have scheduled in the queue for each particular game. If the backlogs are different lengths, then in a given session, I'm not generating thumbnails for all of the games during the same time window, and I can still end up with repeats. But for now, this seemed like a cool case study. It was an opportunity to address a problem that I specifically had, and then through iterative development, identify the best solutions for those problems. And that's been a lot of fun, and so I wanted to share that with you. I know this video was a little different. It was long, first of all. So if you made it to the end, congratulations slash I'm sorry, whichever fits. But yeah, I thought it was an interesting experiment in talking about how I approached and then solved a problem. And so I wanted to share that with all of you. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye. Not a potamus. Ponderous.